to New York. That's where we find CTV's Colton Praill once again this morning for us. Colton, we heard from the Prime Minister. He was weighing in on a host of different topics. What are you hearing in terms of reaction to our Canadian presence there?
Yeah, his comments last night, I think, were particularly interesting, especially when it comes to his reflection on the biggest decision that Canada made at this United Nations General Assembly, and Canada not alone, of course, in recognizing Palestinian statehood. But it's important to note that the other countries, many of the other countries who recognize Palestinian statehood, along with Canada, and who were in trade conflicts or disputes with the United States recently, had trade deals. France had a trade deal. The UK had a trade deal. Canada did not. And so there was a big question as to whether or not there was going to be blowback from this decision. And we had heard from American officials through readouts that did not acknowledge that recognition of Palestinian statehood. And we had heard indirectly from people like Senator of State Marco Rubio talking about the lack of international influence of Canada and the other countries who had recognized Palestinian statehood as being, insufficient to properly coerce Israel into being forced into acknowledging or accepting a two-state solution. He was quick to point out it would be Israel and the United States who were having those conversations. But what we hadn't heard from was Mark Carney on the other side of things. Does he worry that this jeopardizes Canadian trade relations with the U.S.? This is a very clear schism on foreign policy on a pretty important issue to Donald Trump. And asked about that last night, he was very clear that this was a choice that Canada was making, in his words, on principle and on values. He was saying that's why Canada was doing it, and that we dictate our own foreign policy. Now, he has gone on to say that those negotiations with the U.S. are ongoing, that really focusing those talks around the review, the upcoming review in 2026 of the USMCA, or the CUSMA Free Trade Agreement that exists between Canada and Mexico and the United States. And when it comes to that, there has been more of a shift in tone from all three nations, moving away from perhaps a short-term trade deal towards something that looks at the renewal, potential upgrade of USMCA or of CUSMA. And so he was pretty quick to dismissed the idea that this was going to have a negative impact on Canada's trade relations with the U.S., but also that should be a hindrance to making the decision that he made. Either way, it was the first time we'd heard from him on that, and whether you agree or not, it was the answer that had been missing in all of this, because that decision is not made in a vacuum.
Colton, I do want to get to the other big story from the UN, and that is President Trump's reversal on the ongoing war in Ukraine. The president saying now he believes that Ukraine can regain some territory from Russia that has been taken by Russia. We're going to be hearing from Zelensky at some point this morning. What has the reaction been? Tell us more about this about-face from Trump.
Yeah, it's been muted so far, largely, I think, because of where this is coming from. Mr. Carney was quick to point out that, when asked about this wasn't necessarily a change in policy. It's definitely a change in tone. This is the president saying something that sounds very different from what he's been saying in the past, where he's been calling for peace between Ukraine and Russia, and oftentimes blaming Volodymyr Zelensky, although more recently putting increased pressure on Vladimir Putin to find that peace. It's a very significant shift to, go from calling for peace to calling for conflict and saying Ukraine can win the war. However, this is a president who frequently does 180s on topics, who frequently changes his mind. And so at this point, it's too early to determine if this is a policy shift or a tonal shift from the White House. What Mark Carney referred to last night was that he appreciated the president's insights, and he was looking forward to further cooperation where there were issues to work against Russia in this matter, whether that be financial sanctions, increased tariffs, the potential of using more of the funds from frozen Russian assets. All of those conversations are things that Canada is having right now. The G7 finance ministers meet at the start of October specifically to pursue and move forward that agenda and the secondary sanctions possibility. And Mark Carney said that's something he had a quick chat with Scott Bessent, the U.S. Treasury Secretary, in a very brief pull-aside at the UNGA. So leaders are looking at this very optimistically. You even saw Volodymyr Zelensky saying his bilateral meeting with Donald Trump right before that statement came out was one of the most progressive conversations, or in pushing the issue forward, that he had with the U.S. president. He made those comments to Ukrainian state television, but there is still some caution there, given how frequently Donald Trump does flip-flop on issues.
Indeed. All right, Colton Praill for us at the UN. Colton, we're going to check in with you, and I'll mention again that we are expecting to hear from Zelensky at the UN in a short time. Back